Hi everyone, welcome to another painting tutorial from Promethean Paints. Today we're going to be painting some Death Korps Krieg, my favourite faction, focusing on the Lord Marshall Dreir. A lot of these methods can be used across the entire faction. I know the horse colour is a little bit different. Usually they're the pale white, but I already have a tutorial available. It is a PDF tutorial, one of my very first ones. And I'll put a link in the description to that video. But I wanted the Marshal to have a not quite zombie horse, and this is an ode to a horse I rode many years ago when I was a little Boy Scout. So, base coated the horse in AK Hull Red, but any dark reddish brown will do. Then, using the airbrush, we're doing a sort of heavy zenithal highlight here. What I want to do is really covering quite a lot of the miniature in the Vallejo white ink, but I'm making sure I'm hitting it from the top down so that we leave a little bit of that dark reddish brown in the deepest recesses. I wanted a bright horse with this one. I didn't want it too dark. You know, the white horses are actually quite bright as well, and I didn't want this sort of it's a sort of a bay chestnut golden brown colour, and I really wanted it to stand out on the battlefield and not be too dark. So the shadows here will be very subtle, but they will be there. As you saw at the beginning, I've sort of part assembled this model. I've built the horse, but I didn't glue on the Marshal, his body, so it could be easily taken away. In hindsight, I would leave off that bit of barbed wire stuff as well on the horse's right hand side. It really does get in the way a bit later on. So if you've not already built it and you're looking to build it, leave off that little bit until you've finished and then pluck it back on. It will make this painting process a bit easier. You could dry brush this stage instead of, if you haven't got an airbrush, you could dry brush. Use a nice fine tipped dry brush, round headed. Don't use white ink, just use like AK Intense White or Ionic White, any good white, and gently dry brush this on. You could start from a very light grey off-white primer and then do shading with watered down contrast paints if you didn't have an airbrush. As I've mentioned before and in previous videos, my airbrush is a relatively cheap one, £30 from Amazon. It does what I need it to do. I will be putting out a video over the next couple of weeks just going over some airbrushing techniques if anyone's looking to start. But for about £100 to £150 you can get yourself some pretty decent airbrush kit to get you going. So the next step, once we've done the white ink, is now we've moved on to AK Deep Brown, which, although the name says deep brown, when put through the airbrush, it's got this nice golden hue to it. It's a really nice colour. So again, working like we did with the airbrush, we're going downwards, making sure we're covering all of that white, leaving a tiny little bit of that black red in the deepest recesses. Short sharp bursts, thinning down your paint obviously for the airbrush, 50-50 generally, so a couple of drops of paint, a couple of drops of water. I don't use flow improver or airbrush thinner. I find they can have some negative impacts when you do washes, ink washes, contrast washes, oil washes. I find that it sometimes burns the paint off, some of the, especially the airbrush thinner, so just water will do. So once Mr. Horsey's had his first coat, the second one is then a 50-50 mix of AK deep brown and AK golden brown. I mixed the two in the airbrush gun themselves. I had a little bit of deep brown left in there, so it's added a couple of drops of the golden brown. Now, 50-50 mix, or it could be any variant you choose of that. You could add more of the golden brown than the deep brown. This is all personal preference really, to go bright. If you want it to go very, very bright, then add a bit more golden brown to it, but start off at a 50-50 mix. You can always go up more if need be. So here what I'm doing is I'm just focusing on some key areas of the horse that I want to be a bit brighter, which are the sort of flanks, the neck, the ears, and any like largely raised muscle groups that look like the skin is stretched or the light is reflecting from them. So in this next part, you'll see I flash up some AK ultra matte varnish. I actually went to do it, and then I thought, no, I've got a few more airbrushing steps I need to do. So don't airbrush the matte varnish at this point, just carry on going. So I've got some back to the white because I want to give the pinkish purple hue to the feet. So just back to the white now, and all I'm doing is a couple of short sharp sprays aiming towards the bottom part of the foot, just where it meets the nails, or its hooves, hoofy nails, and just doing a short couple of bursts that we get a nice haloing effect from pure white at the very base by his toes, and just up just below his sort of kneecap area. And then through the airbrush, I watered down some contrast Doomfire magenta, just a couple of drops, which is like a 50-50 mix because it's a really powerful colour. Usually I don't generally thin down the contrast paints, but Doomfire magenta is a little bit potent. And then I just cover the white and a little bit of the brown fur as well, just up a little bit, as I say, just towards the bottom of his knees, to where it'll go. Then you'll get a nice blend going through. I then make a wash of AK whole red in my wash pot. So this is heavily thinned down. So it's 1 part paint, 5-6 parts water, very thin. And this is why I didn't do the matte varnish, because sometimes with a matte varnish it will stain rather than paint, so you can get a lot of pigment build up in certain areas. But all I do here is just wash this very gently over the horse, and it will just pool in some of those recesses, bring a bit of definition, darken things down ever so slightly, just so that we can bring those back up again. This is very subtle. You can add 2 or 3 coats of this if you want. I just do the one, as I didn't want too much contrast from the light to the dark in the shadows of the horse. So carrying on with the brushwork, we're now just going to introduce a few more highlights. So this is where your previous airbrush mixes that you did, like your 50-50 mix, now can sort of steer where you're going to go with your highlights here. So I've gone back to my sort of 50-50 mix, and I've made a glaze with these. So a glaze is just a heavily watered down variant of your paint. So with 1 drop of paint, it could be up to 5 drops of water. And what it does is it will allow the colours that are underneath to show through, but you're just very carefully, very slowly applying brighter or darker by using your paint strokes. So wherever you paint, the most paint is left where the brush is left. So as I see here, I want to highlight towards the top end, so I'm pulling the paint upwards so that all paint is left when you remove the brush on the areas you want to be brighter. And the thing with glazes is they're not usually done in one coat. They can take 5, 6 or 7 layers to build up the intensity, and with each layer you add a little bit more in a smaller area to get that nice gradient effect. So what I'm doing here is I'm using about a 50-50 mix made into a glaze, so heavily watered down. I'm just glazing that paint over certain areas just so I can build up some highlights, reintroduce some of that brighter colour. Then once I'm happy with that, I then go to just pure golden brown, again made into a glaze. So each paint is a little bit different to how you create it into a glaze. It can vary from, some paints just need a few drops of water, others need a lot. And I found with this golden brown colour, it needed quite a bit of water. So it's probably about an 80-20 mix of water to paint. So I'm just working over a smaller area, and again just bringing in those highlights over those raised areas just to make them stand out. And then it was at this stage that I coat it with some ultra matte varnish. Does a couple of things, brings all the colours together, it protects the model, and it offers a slight texture to the horse as well. The matte varnish makes it a kind of rough texture. It just adds to the overall look and feel of the miniature. I then went and base coated all the parts again with AK matte black. No, I didn't. It was AK Tenebris Grey. I generally use AK matte black, but I use Tenebris Grey because a number of items we're going to be doing have a base coat of Tenebris Grey. It's got a nice hint of purple to it. So first little stage is just finishing off the horse. I'm using AK Magenta and AK Intense Pink and a little dry brush. And the AK Magenta, I just do a sort of heavyish dry brush over the bottom of his feet and legs, and then I'll do a lighter dry brush with the AK Intense Pink just to get some definition on those raised areas. So now we're moving on to the coat that he's wearing. So we use 3 colours for the Krieg blue grey. So it's base coat everything with dark sea blue, and then we add mixes of AK anthracite and AK spectrum blue. Now there isn't too much to paint here, so we base coat it all in the dark sea blue, and that's our darkest colour. So what we're really doing is avoiding having to do any washes. So we base coat in the dark sea blue, that gives us our darkest colour. Then the anthracite acts as our mid-tone, and the spectrum blue acts as our highlight. So to get a nice gradient, I do a 50-50 mix of the dark sea blue and the anthracite, and then I paint over probably 90% of what we've just painted, only leaving the dark sea blue in the recesses. And once you're happy with that, we then move on to just pure anthracite, which is now an even smaller area, so probably only about 50% of what we've now got left. Making sure we do edge highlight with this colour, bring some definition. This is our first sort of attempt at a highlight now. Even though it's a layer, it does start adding a highlight to our dark colour. And then to gradually introduce our real true highlights, we do a 50-50 mix of anthracite and spectrum blue. Again, this is generally more of an edge highlight, but we are picking out those heavily raised areas, especially the collars by his neck. Then I use pure spectrum blue as just a final subtle edge highlight on those areas that are really sticking out. Bits on the collar and a couple of bits around the bottom of his coat. Not too much, we don't want too much of a highlight here. As you can see, we're working in stages here. We're not base coating everything first and then going in with highlights and that. There's a lot of detail on this model, and I sometimes find where there's lots of detail on the model, it's best to work in complete items. So we've done his blue-grey cloak. Now we're going to move on to the sort of red sash that's on his that's covering the horse. And for that I do a base coat of AK black red and tenebrous grey. It's a 50-50 mix, and this is going to be our darkest red colour. And what I wanted here was a sort of effect that gives, we've got really dark and extremely bright red with a gradient in the middle, but it's quite a harsh gradient from the very dark to the very bright. So once you've painted it, base coated it all in the that black-red tenebrous grey mix, we then hit it with intense white. And all I do here is apply a white highlight in the centre of where I want to be the most brightest. So imagine we're going to have a centre line of bright red, then either side of that it gradiented out, and then we'll be glazing back into the black-red tenebrous grey mix. So this white red is the sort of central point of our immediate highlight. So I use ionic red, which is like an AK deep red, or maybe a Mephiston red. I find the ionic red is really powerful. I add 1 drop of water to this just normally, just to thin it down, and then I paint over the white and a little bit either side of it, and we get a stark highlight now from very dark red to very bright red. It took a couple of coats just to get the coverage needed, and then I make a 50-50 mix of the ionic red and the black red, make it into a glaze, so heavily water it down, and then I push the paint from the red that was on the other side of the white, so either side of the white, I push the paint away from that so that it collects in the shadow areas, and so we'll get a natural gradient from that center line of red down to getting darker into the deepest recesses. Now this will take a number of coats, I think 4 or 5 it took, but it's worth it. It's an easy way of getting some nice transitions apart from going through numerous colours, and the layers don't take long to dry. seconds for each one really, because it's so thin, and we're going through a heat wave in the country as well, another one. So yeah, paint doesn't take long to dry at all. Once I'm done with the glazing there, I just get the ionic red and reintroduce a thin line of it where our central highlight was, and then I do some stabby motions with the brush, a little bit of paint on the brush, a couple of stabby motions to create little dots, and then I'll do little dots that just go out of the shadow into the shadow area, so from the bright red into the shadow area, creates a little bit of texture and a fun little transition point between the bright red and the dark red. Next item up is the pink sash that he is wearing. So with that, I base coat in AK Violet Red. So it hangs down his left hand side and it goes up across his chest, and there's a little bit on the back as well. I also paint the rope tassels in this colour. Once that's dry, I then apply a careful wash with Warhammer Dreir Violet. So with AK Magenta, I now do an edge highlight, and I cover probably 80% of the area again of the sort of sash, leaving that violet red and the dukey violet wash in the deepest recesses. For the ropey tassels, I just pick out the biggest edges and each of the sort of ribs that they've modelled on the little ropes. And then with the AK Intense Pink, I do a final edge highlight and pick out those ribs again, but just on a smaller area, and just pick out the brightest points on the sash. So we're just over an hour in, and we've got a big job now to tackle, which is the leather. There's a lot of leather on these horses, mind numbing. When I painted the 10 Death Riders, but hopefully I've got a method here that helps speed it up a little bit. If you're using contrast paints, then you can do it very quickly. But what I'm trying to do here is create a method where you don't have to worry about doing washes and then going layering and highlighting. What we do is we use the darkest color. That's going to be our darkest color. Then we have layers and highlights over the top to stop us from having to do washes. So each color gets brighter and complements. So the first color we're using is AK Afro Shadow, a very, very dark red brown. And the idea here is you just base coat all of the leather in this color. If you can, leave a tiniest bit of the tenebrous grey in the deepest recesses, or where two items join that aren't together, leave a little bit of that tenebrous grey. Doesn't matter if you can't, but if you can, it just helps sometimes with the transition between the different parts. So there's a lot of leather on this guy, so just work around the model, painting it all in, taking care around the horse's skin. If you do happen to get any on the horse and you're using a wet palette, hopefully you've got some of those colours left over that you've used just to help blend it out. So once you've got all the Afro Shadow base coated, the next step is going to be our first layer, which will be a 50-50 mix of the Afro Shadow and deep brown. And now go over the areas again, but leave the Afro Shadow in the deepest recesses. So you're covering about 90% of the Afro Shadow, just leaving the Afro Shadow in the deepest recesses and any areas around any buttons and that. So take your time here. So this is our first layer, but it also acts as our first highlight as well. So really this is colouring in and staying within the lines, leaving a bit of the line showing, and the line is the Afro Shadow. So once it's all base coated, so once that next bit's done, we then move on. Really, this is our first highlight, and this is with pure deep brown. So this is a thick edge highlight around all of the items. You can also start to add in some scratches, but yeah, primarily this is an edge highlight. Then our final little bit of detail, we use AK cork, and again this is an edge highlight but not over everything. This is only over the areas that are heavily worn, would catch the light a bit more. But the thing with leather is we usually do these highlights to pick out the areas that are more heavily worn, not necessarily are catching the light more. Materials sometimes don't work like that. I know obviously in our world it's very, very small. We have to edge highlight everything so that we can see it because it's such a small scale. And that's what our deep brown was for. That was our sort of edge highlight. This is now a highlight that brings and shows damage and wear and tear. So you can do as much or as little of this as you want. Sometimes a little is more, but focus on those areas that you would think would be more worn. So that's one large task done. Still 2 left. So the next one is where we do some non-metallic metal. And the first off we're going to do is non-metallic metal silver. Now I hope this is nice and easy for you. This is the simplest method I have, but effective. It uses 2 colours. So it's Vallejo Basalt Grey, or you could use AK Basalt Grey, and white. I use AK Intense White. Now everything was base coated in that AK Tenebris Grey, and now with the Basalt Grey I've watered it down a little bit, just so it's got a couple of bits of water in there just to help it flow off the brush and to help it blend from the darkest colour to the lightest colour. It's also a very thick paint. The Vallejo one is very, very thick. And the idea here is I'm moving the paint from the deepest shadow out onto the bright points. Now this isn't a realistic non-metallic metal. I'm just going for contrast from darks to lights and just hitting the areas that I think would be brighter. Now this initial coat of basalt grey, what we're doing is we're pretty much covering 90% of the areas you want to be silver, just leaving that Tenebris grey in the deepest recesses and shadows. Any areas that overlap or join together, just leave that little line of Tenebris grey like we did with the Afro shadow. So really here, as long as you edge highlight everything and fill in about 90% and just leave some Tenebris grey in the deepest recesses. And then the idea here is we imagine where the light is hitting, and that's where we'll get brighter and brighter. And to get brighter and brighter, we just add more white. So at first we probably have a 70-30 mix, then a 50-50 mix, then we start favouring white, 70-30 to white, and then a very, very small area has 100% white. And all I do here is just work those highlights out towards the areas that I imagine would be brighter based on the shape of the item that we're painting and where I imagine the light to be coming from. Now the light at this point is coming from the top left, so from his sword arm downwards, but as like I said, we're not going for ultra realism here. I just wanted to give the effect that these items are metallic and we're using matte paints, and that's where we get our non-metallic metals from. If you were doing this in true metallics, I would use a dark silver, AK gunmetal, iron warriors, dark aluminium, just a dark silver. Potentially give it a wash of Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade, and then do a subtle highlight with a brighter silver. But either way, there's a lot of silver to paint on this guy. it's everywhere, so just take your time to pick it all out. So I keep the camera rolling here so you can see what I'm doing, and using the paint to go around certain shapes, especially around his shoulder pads and helmet. The good thing with silver is you can get a really good silver effect by only painting like 20% of the area that is going to be silver, and leaving the rest really, really dark. And you can get quite heavily worn effects by doing it that way. So that was our first layer. Base coat Tenebris Grey, first layer Basalt Grey. I then do a mix. At this point about 70-30. And again, I ensure that I edge highlight those areas that I want to be bright and fill in, moving to the central points of where I want my bright points. So if you're looking to highlight a square box, your first layer covers 60%. Your next layer, which is brighter, covers a smaller area and moves in towards the area that you want to be bright. So if you imagine a torch, central point is very, very bright, and then it gets darker as it goes out. So when we're painting dark to light. So your dark area is bigger, your brighter area is smaller. And all I do really here is just add more and more white to the mix, and the more brighter colour that's added, the less area I paint. But always make sure just to do a little edge highlight around as much as you can, because the metallics do work in a way that most of the area is highlighted. And when you move up to your very, very bright layers, you only edge highlight a little bit. And when you're at pure white, those are only used for just slight, very, very small spots, dots here and there. I keep the camera rolling here just so you can see what I'm doing. There's loads of reference photos at the end, but this is a nice quick method of doing some non-metallic metal silver. It just so happens there's a lot of silver on this guy, but there's a lot of shape as well, so it's not a bad one to practice on. So at this stage I will go quiet now. There's not much more I can say on this method. I know in some tutorials the person presenting will all of a sudden cut to the next step. I long format my videos, so right now for the next 10 or so minutes is just the process of me doing the non-metallic metal across the entire miniature. So you can speed it up if you want to, or you can just watch it just to see where I'm adding in the highlights. Notice as well, I said I was going to be quiet, but I also try and highlight the areas that look cool, not necessarily would be realistically highlighted. So for instance, his robot foot, that's got a nice highlight to it. His helmet and his sword, it's just got some highlights to them where they wouldn't naturally have a highlight, but I wanted them to stand out. So add highlights, pick and choose where you want, try and keep them consistent. You don't want a highlight next to a highlight because it doesn't kind of work like that. Always have a highlight next to a very, very dark area. there we have it. So lots of mixes of paints going from, but it's just using the two colours, basalt grey and white, adding more and more white to the mix and putting less and less paint on the model, using glazes here and there where it's necessary. It takes a lot of practice. Silver is quite forgiving. You can do scratches and marks here and there to show the effect that it is worn silver. Gold is a bit trickier, and that's our next beast to vanquish. But like I said, you could just paint this with your normal true metallic colours, but as it was a character, I wanted to go the extra mile. Now equally, there's quite a bit of gold on this guy, so we base coat all of the gold in Afro Shadow. That's our darkest colour. Then our first highlight is done with a 50-50 mix of Afro Shadow and golden brown. Not golden brown, British khaki, sorry. And that will give us our first highlight. Now, there are many videos on non-metallic gold. Again, mine, I focus on the areas that would pick out the light coming from the light source, which is on his left hand side coming downwards. But I also pick out those areas that would look cool as well, that you want to just highlight. I try and keep some real world factors in this one, so just remember where you do your brightest point, like the brightest point there in that central area, it will be dark completely opposite, and then you would do another highlight. So always have a dark area next to your highlight and then have another highlight after that, just so that you, otherwise if you have a bright point next to a bright point, where there would looks like there would be a shadow line, where there was a curve there or an angle, it just doesn't look right, and it's your opportunity to introduce your contrast, which is what non-metallic metal is all about, your contrast between dark and light. But what I'm really doing here is sketching in where I want my highlights by laying down the first highlight with this 50-50 mix. Then once you're happy with that, we now just move into pure British khaki. And you'll notice in the pot, the colour looks quite dark, like a brown colour. But when you start applying it, it does have that golden hue to it. Now, with this next highlight, it's an even smaller area that you're covering. Always try doing edge highlight, and you're just filling in, moving the paint towards your brightest point. So again, like the silver, we go from, halfway from our last highlight towards our bright points, so that we get brighter the further away from the shadow area. So then we do a 50-50 mix of British khaki and AK ice yellow. This will create our first, what I would call highlight, like real highlight now. And only over a very small spot we add this colour. If you were painting this with true metallics, then yeah, a dark gold, AK rusty gold. Then with you could do a flesh wash over the top of it if you wanted to get a nice rich gold, and then do a highlight with AK old gold. But any dark gold with a light highlight of a lighter gold over the top. Going brass or copper is also an option for these guys. Sort of like a Sycorax bronze as a highlight over a brass scorpion would look quite good. And then our spot highlight is just done with AK ice yellow. Less is more here, not too much. Very powerful colour is ice yellow. So just little dots here. This is where the light is shining directly down on it. It's our brightest points. And try and maintain that bright point next to a dark point. That will really boost how bright your bright spots are. That's often the mistake painters will make, is they'll put a bright spot next to a semi-bright spot, and it will just wash each other out. As you have a bright bit next to a dark bit, it boosts your shadow and it boosts your highlight as well. So there were just a couple of little bits. The horse's mane and his plume, they were base coated in the tenebrous grey and black red mix. So just base coat them in those colours, and then just do edge highlighting with some pure ionic red, your sort of deep red colour. For the mane, you can just do little lines coming off of it, and that's all I did with those. No need to blending or anything like that. Just AK black, red and tenebrous grey mix 50-50 that we used earlier, and then just a flat highlight of the ionic red. For the horse's ears and the sort of Aquila scar that he's got, to blend in with the rest of the Death Riders that I did, they had a pinkish colour to them. So AK Dead Red, it looks really red in the pot, but it goes out very pink. Just water it down a little bit and just paint it into the Aquila, the inside of his ears. And there is also some numbers and lettering, the M41 on his leg, just fill it in with those. You could then go over it with some Caribou Crimson or some just pinky fleshy wash if you wanted to make it look sore, but for myself it was just painting it in with those colours. So we're nearly there, just some final bits to do. So one of the last tasks is just to do our glowing and heat effects. So much like in non-metallic metal where you have contrast, with glowing effects you have massive contrast between your dark and your bright. So the darker the paint, the cooler the colour, the brighter the paint, the hotter the colour. And we start off going from our coolest, so darker, to our hottest, brighter. So we're going with reds here. So our darkest, coldest part of the glowing effect is with AK wine red. So just go over and base coat anywhere where you want to do your glowing effect with the wine red. On the horse's eyes, the sort of goggles that it's wearing, I paint the entirety of the lens and a little bit of rim that's surrounding it. And it's the same with the Marshall's lenses. I paint the full lens and a little bit of the area below it as well. To start getting our heat, we add some bright areas. So I use AK Blood Red, which is Evil Sun Scarlet if you're using Warhammer paints. It's equal as good as the Blood Red. So the Blood Red, I paint the actual lens itself, and I paint the bottom section of the vent on the horse's, by the horse's head, and the bottom half of the vent on the back of the Marshall, and I paint the whole lens in the Blood Red, so that the wine red is left in the furthest part away from where you're imagining your heat source is coming from, or your light source is coming from. I then use some AK Intense White, and I do a dot in each of the Marshall's eyes. I do a dot in the top corner of each of the horse's lens, and then a crescent in the bottom section opposite that dot, to show it shows the light coming in from the top and then reflecting a crescent on the bottom. Then I paint the bottom part in white. Now the reason for using white is our fluorescent paints work amazingly over the top of fluorescence, over whites. So I use some Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red, and I paint over, not too heavily here, you don't put too much of this on the brush. I paint over all the area we've just painted, so all the wine red and the white, paint over the entirety of the area with the Green Stuff World Fluorescent Red. And then with the Fluorescent Orange from AK, just paint the areas that you did as white, so the dots and the crescents, just paint those with the Fluorescent Orange, and you've got yourself heat effect and lens glow effects. At this stage, if you wanted to do some washes just to get some contrast between areas around the leather that are joining together that might not blend well, just use some heavily watered down Tenebrous Grey, or you could use Nuln Oil or Agrax Earthshade, but treat them like you were doing with your glazes, not too much on the brush, and just push that paint into those areas where you wanted, just to get some shadow and definition, so that the two areas stand out from each other. But if you've been following the method, there shouldn't be too many of those. By the way, we've avoided using washes because we've used our base coating as our sort of panel liner. And there he is. The base was painted completely in Warhammer Doomball Brown. I then made a mix of Vallejo Old Rush pigment and water, and then painted that over the top. It's in I've got a Trench Crusade tutorial that shows how I do that. But I know obviously basing is quite individual, not everyone does it the same way. So here he is alongside his Death Rider pals. I find that horse blends in nicely. We've maintained that pink on the feet, and the lens glows. All the colours across all the miniatures are the same. As I said, there's a tutorial for the Death Riders in a separate PDF, which you can find it's a video, which you can find as one of my oldest videos. So yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this tutorial. There's a couple of videos now showing all of the units that we've done. I am a commission painter, so please feel free to reach out if you'd like me to paint any of your miniatures. I give a quote for free. Turnaround is pretty quick, and I only generally do one sort of tier of painting, which is this tier of painting. I don't do a tabletop ready or anything like that. We can work together as to the finish that you want to get for your miniatures. So yeah, reach out, like, comment, subscribe, all those amazing things. I hope you've enjoyed the tutorial. I hope it's a starting point for any non-metallic metals that you want to do in the future. Please feel free to share what you've painted with me, and yeah, happy painting, my fellow painters.